40 to 50 mounds, gone, not lost, destroyed. After 1950. Right now, cars are doing 70 miles per hour over sacred ground in Illinois. The Cahokia Mounds were the foundation of one of the greatest cities in North American history, and the Illinois Department of Transportation bulldozed part of it without asking a single Native nation's permission. Because in 1960, the law requiring anyone to ask didn't exist yet. Before we get to the highway, understand what was here. At its height, around 1100 CE, this was a city of more than 20,000 people. That made it larger than London at the same moment in history. And yet most Americans have never heard its name spoken in a classroom. The city we call Cahokia stretched across approximately 6 square miles of the Mississippi River floodplain in what is now southwestern Illinois. 6 square miles, larger than present-day downtown St. Louis, across the river. Today, much of that footprint is under subdivisions, strip malls, and interstate pavement. The complex once held more monumental structures than survive in the Roman Forum and Palatine Hill combined. These were not random earthen hills. They were platforms for governance, ceremony, and community, engineered across generations by the people archaeologists call the Mississippians. The Osage Nation and the Quapaw Nation, two federally recognized tribal nations, identify the Mississippian builders of Cahokia as among their ancestors. Their connection runs through language. Both nations speak languages in the Degi-Ha-Suan family, and through oral tradition carried across centuries. For the Osage and the Quapaw, Cahokia is not a ruin. It is a named place in a living geographic and spiritual memory. That distinction matters enormously to what happened in 1960. Because when the bulldozers arrived, nobody called the Osage Nation. Nobody called the Quapaw Nation. Nobody was legally required to. And that is the heart of this story. This is not a documentary about ancient history. This is an investigation into how a civilization was erased, legally, systematically, and within living memory, and who is still fighting to reclaim it. The erasure did not happen 1,000 years ago. It happened last Tuesday, in historical terms. Illinois state law did not extend full protection to Cahokia Mounds as a state historic site until 1925, nearly 1,000 years after the city's peak. And meaningful enforcement against adjacent commercial development didn't begin until UNESCO designated the site a World Heritage Property in 1982. That left a 57-year window during which private developers, road planners, and county governments could do almost anything they wanted. Most of them did exactly that. To understand how systematic the destruction was, you need a timeline. Not the ancient timeline, the modern one. 1954, Collinsville Road, Illinois Route 40, was widened and rerouted through the outer Cahokia precinct. At least 2 mounds in the outer mound group were destroyed or severely damaged during that road project. No archaeological team was on standby. No consultation with descendant nations had occurred. The road went through. Soil undisturbed since 1100 CE, gone. 6 years later, the larger blow came. In 1960, the Illinois Department of Transportation graded the bed of Interstate 55 through the southern portion of the Cahokia precinct. The National Historic Preservation Act, the federal law that would have required archaeological review before ground was broken, was not passed until 1966. 6 years too late. Think about what 1966 means. It was the year after the Voting Rights Act. During the height of the Civil Rights Movement, the machinery of destruction moved faster than the machinery of protection. It almost always does. Here is what the construction scene looked like, based on what archaeologists and historians have documented. Earth-moving equipment arrived on the southern edge of the precinct. The ground beneath the equipment had not been disturbed in roughly 900 years. There was no archaeological monitoring. The soil was graded, compacted, and buried under asphalt within weeks. The smell of turned floodplain earth, dark, iron-rich, layered, would have been the last evidence that something old was there. Then, the concrete came. The highway opened. Thousands of cars began driving over the buried edge of the greatest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico. Most drivers didn't know. Most still don't. The road signs pointed to St. Louis, never to the mounds. Then came the motel. Sometime in the early 1960s, a Holiday Inn was constructed directly atop a mound remnant in the Cahokia Tract. To the Mississippian people who built the original structure, that mound would have been a platform for community ceremony or for the kind of governance decisions that held a city of 20,000 people together. Travelers checked in, they checked out. For decades, guests slept in rooms whose foundation sat on 900-year-old compressed earth, a monument reduced to a parking lot amenity. The mound beneath that building is unrecoverable. When the Holiday Inn was finally demolished, what was beneath it was gone. No archaeology, no record, no consultation, just gone. Now scale that specific loss across the entire greater Cahokia precinct. By 1998, the Cahokia Mounds Museum Society had documented that fewer than 80 of the original approximately 120 mounds remained substantially intact. That means between 40 and 50 mounds, each one an engineered monument, each one a site of human memory, had been plowed, graded, built over, or bisected by roads during the 20th century. Agriculture destroyed some. Suburban sprawl took others. Road construction claimed the rest. All three of those forces accelerated in the same two-decade window, 1950 to 1970. The same window when the Cahokia precinct went from a semi-rural floodplain to an incorporated suburb of the St. Louis metro area. The pattern is not accidental. It is a pattern of policy. Federal highway funding flowed into Illinois. Suburban development followed the highway corridors, and the sites in the way were removed because no law required anyone to stop and ask, "What is this?" or "Who does this belong to?" But what came next in this timeline? The part that involves living people, living nations, and a legal fight that is still happening. Nobody teaches that part. By 1964, the federal government finally acted, sort of. The National Park Service designated Cahokia Mounds a National Historic Landmark. That designation arrived after the highway was already built, after the motel was already on the mound. The landmark designation was a recognition that came after the most irreversible damage had already been done. Think of it as putting a historic preservation plaque on a house after half of it burned down. Then came 1982. UNESCO designated Cahokia Mounds a World Heritage Site, one of only 24 sites in the United States to hold that status. For context, the other 23 include the Statue of Liberty, the Grand Canyon, and Monticello. Cahokia sits in that list. Most Americans cannot name it. And even after the UNESCO designation, suburban development on parcels adjacent to the protected site continued through the 1980s and 1990s. The legal protection applied to the approximately 2,200 acres within the state historic site boundary. But the original city's footprint covered 6 square miles, more than 4 times that area. The parts outside the boundary remained unprotected. Subdivisions filled them in. Strip malls filled them in. The bones of the city are still under those streets, unexcavated, inaccessible, lost to future archaeology. Now consider what the highway did to something more abstract but equally real: the visitor experience. Cahokia today receives approximately 300,000 visitors per year. Stonehenge, a far smaller site, with a fraction of the engineering complexity, draws more than 1 million visitors annually. Scholars who study heritage tourism argue that part of Cahokia's visitor gap comes directly from what Interstate 55 did to the site's physical approach. The natural corridor into the Cahokia precinct, the line of sight and movement that would have given first-time visitors a sense of the city's true scale, was severed by the highway construction. You now approach a UNESCO World Heritage Site by taking an exit ramp off an interstate. The visual and physical drama of arriving at a great city has been replaced by a highway interchange, and 3 miles of neon-lit fast food signs point toward St. Louis, while the signs for the mounds are easy to miss entirely. 300,000 visitors per year is roughly the same as a mid-sized regional history museum. That number would almost certainly be higher if the approach to the site had been protected instead of paved. The highway didn't just destroy mounds, it buried the story in plain sight. This is the compounding nature of infrastructure destruction. You don't just lose the physical site. You lose the experience, the understanding, the emotional impact. You lose the moment when a first-time visitor realizes they are standing in the footprint of a city that was here before Notre Dame was built. So the mounds are compromised. The highway is built. The UNESCO designation has come and gone. Here is the forward question this story demands. Who was never consulted through any of this, and what are they doing about it now? The Osage Nation and the Quapaw Nation maintained oral traditions about this river city across centuries of forced removal, across the Trail of Tears, across allotment policies designed to sever them from their ancestral geography. Their connection to this place did not require a federal designation to be real. The question now is whether the legal system that enabled the destruction will become the legal system that enables repair. To understand who was left out of every decision about Cahokia, you need to understand the legal framework that governed those decisions. Or rather, the legal framework that didn't exist. When Route 40 was rerouted through the Outer Mounds in 1954, there was no federal requirement to consult tribal nations about impacts to ancestral sites. When Interstate 55 was graded in 1960, same answer. The National Historic Preservation Act, passed in 1966, created the Section 106 review process, requiring federal agencies to consult with affected parties, including tribal nations, before projects that could impact historic properties. But Section 106 did not apply retroactively. The highway was already there. The mounds were already under asphalt. The Holiday Inn was already taking reservations. The law arrived 6 years after the most significant single act of destruction. 6 years is not a long time in political history. It is an eternity in construction. Now add the curriculum failure on top of the infrastructure failure. A 2020 review by the Network for Public Education found that most standard American history curricula skip from Paleo-Indian cultures directly to European contact, with no mention of Mississippian urban civilization anywhere in between. No Cahokia, no 20,000-person city, no platform mounds, no indigenous urban planning. Just, people were here, then Europeans arrived. That gap is not an accident of editing. It is the textbook version of the same erasure that Interstate 55 performed in physical space. If you never teach that a city existed here, you never have to explain why it was paved over. The empty continent narrative, the idea that North America was essentially unsettled wilderness before European contact, was not just a historical lie. It was a functional justification for treating indigenous sites as expendable. And it lives on in every American history textbook that skips the Mississippians. The textbook and the highway tell the same story, the same false story. Meanwhile, something critical was happening in university basements and museum storage rooms across the Midwest. Earlier archaeologists, excavating Cahokia across the 20th century without meaningful tribal consultation, had removed human remains and sacred objects from the site. Those remains went into university collections, museum archives, laboratory storage. In 1990, Congress passed the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA. NAGPRA required institutions holding Native remains and sacred objects to inventory them and initiate repatriation processes with descendant nations. It was a landmark law. It was also, like the National Historic Preservation Act before it, a law that arrived after decades of extraction. As of 2023, repatriation negotiations between Illinois institutions and descendant tribes, including the Osage Nation, remained ongoing. Those negotiations are part of the national NAGPRA backlog, approximately 90,000 Native American remains still held in U.S. institutions, awaiting return to descendant communities. 90,000. That is not a historical number from the 19th century. That is the count as of recent years, in institutions that exist today, in buildings you could drive to. And here is where the evidence gets harder to ignore. The Osage Nation did not wait for institutions to call them. They showed up anyway. In 2019, Osage Nation cultural representatives formally engaged with Cahokia Mounds state historic site archaeologists. They came to assert descendant community status under Illinois state law, to claim a seat at the table that hadn't existed in 1960. They brought scholarly linguistic evidence connecting the Degi Ha Suan language family to the Mississippian builders of Cahokia. They brought oral tradition maintained across generations of forced displacement, across removal to Kansas, across allotment, across federal policies designed to sever Indigenous people from their geographic memory. The oral traditions had held. The connection had held. What hadn't held was the legal infrastructure to enforce that connection, and that is what 2019 was about beginning to build. Consider the weight of that meeting. Osage representatives sitting across from Illinois state archaeologists at a table inside a 1989 museum building. 3 miles away, Interstate 55 carried 70,000 vehicles per day over the buried edge of their ancestors' city. The Osage had not been notified before those lanes were poured. They were not consulted when the Holiday Inn was built on the mound. They were arriving, in 2019, to a conversation that should have happened in 1954. 65 years late. The Quapaw Nation, known in their own language as the Quapaw, had been making similar assertions. The Quapaw Nation's Cultural Office has documented oral histories connecting their ancestors to the Great River City, consistent with the Degiha-Siwan linguistic framework and with Pawcataw's scholarly synthesis in his 2009 monograph. Neither the Osage nor the Quapaw had vanished. Neither had the Chickasaw Nation, whose oral traditions also reference the Mississippian world. These are federally recognized tribal nations, among the 574 federally recognized nations in the United States, with active governments, legal departments, cultural offices, and citizens. The narrative of the lost civilization of Cahokia is, in part, a narrative that erases them. Because if the civilization is lost, its descendants don't need to be consulted. If the civilization is living memory, consultation becomes a legal and moral obligation. The Osage and Quapaw nations are asserting the second interpretation, loudly, with documentation, and the institutional resistance to that assertion tells you something about how power still operates around this site. The existing interpretive museum at Cahokia was built in 1989, the same year the Berlin Wall came down. To give you a cultural anchor, it is a facility designed to interpret a city larger than medieval London for approximately 300,000 visitors a year. The scholars who study Indigenous heritage sites consider that facility inadequate. The visitors who travel from overseas to see a UNESCO World Heritage Site arrive, expecting infrastructure commensurate with that designation. What they find is a 1989 building off an interstate exit ramp. In 2022, Illinois allocated approximately $32 million in state capital funds toward a new interpretive center at Cahokia Mounds. $32 million sounds significant until you compare it to infrastructure spending in the same metro area. The United States spent more than that amount building a single highway interchange in the St. Louis region in the same decade that Interstate 55 damaged the Cahokia site. The highway got the money first. The monument is still waiting. Now here is the institutional accountability question the new interpretive center has reopened. The 2022 funding announcement reignited a debate that Illinois officials had not publicly engaged. Should descendant nations have co-governance authority over the Cahokia Mounds State Historic Site? Not advisory status, not consultation rights, co-governance. The argument from Osage and Quapaw scholars is straightforward. This is our ancestors' city. The state of Illinois has been managing it and mismanaging it for decades without us. That needs to change. The institutional response, as of this reporting, has been cautious. Illinois state heritage officials have acknowledged the consultation failures of the 1950s and 60s. They have engaged in NAGPRA repatriation discussions. But formal co-governance, shared decision-making authority over site management, interpretation, and development remains unresolved. That question has direct parallels to Indigenous land rights disputes playing out in federal courts across the United States in 2024 and 2025. From the Bears Ears National Monument co-management framework to tribal water rights cases in the Southwest, the legal and political fight over whether Indigenous nations get a voice in managing their ancestral places is happening right now, in active litigation. Cahokia is one node in a much larger national argument, and the answer Illinois gives about co-governance at Cahokia will be cited in other cases. Precedents set at UNESCO World Heritage Sites carry weight. Here is a metaphor that might clarify the stakes. Imagine if the Roman Forum had been partially bulldozed to build a freeway interchange in 1960, and the Italian government hadn't gotten around to protecting what remained until an international body shamed them into it in 1982. And then imagine that the descendants of the people who built the Forum had been present and documented throughout, but were never once invited to the table when the bulldozers showed up. That is the Cahokia story. Except the people whose ancestors built the Forum were never forcibly removed from Italy, never had their children taken to boarding schools, never had their language outlawed. The Osage and Quapaw nations endured all of that, and they still showed up in 2019 to assert their connection to this place. That is not archaeology. That is survival. But the most revealing part of this story is still ahead, because right now, today, the fight over what Cahokia means and who controls it is live. Right now, in the greater St. Louis metropolitan area, the buried portions of Cahokia are not being excavated. They are being driven over, every day, by people who have no idea what is beneath the pavement. The approximately 2,200 acres of the State Historic Site represent roughly 1/3 of the original city's footprint. The other 2/3, an area the size of several large city neighborhoods, lies under private and commercial development in Collinsville, East St. Louis, and surrounding Illinois communities. Those areas were built out primarily between 1950 and 1980. Under Illinois law and current federal frameworks, some of that subsurface archaeology retains legal protections, but accessing it would require demolishing occupied structures. No political will exists to do that, so the buried mounds stay buried, and above them, a Walmart, a subdivision, a 4-lane road. The NAGPRA repatriation process continues in parallel with all of this. University collections across Illinois and the broader Midwest hold human remains and sacred objects excavated from Cahokia by archaeologists who operated before repatriation law existed. Under NAGPRA, institutions are required to consult with lineal descendants and culturally affiliated tribal nations about the return of those materials. The Osage Nation has been engaged in those negotiations. As of 2023, the process remained active but unresolved for many holdings. Some of those 90,000 remains held in U.S. institutions are from Cahokia. They are in storage rooms and buildings with parking lots and climate control systems and annual budget cycles. They have not been returned, and the institutions holding them are not under legal deadline to complete the process. NAGPRA has teeth, but the enforcement mechanism has consistently been inadequate to the scale of the backlog. The curriculum gap continues in parallel as well. Children in Illinois, in the state where Cahokia sits, are not systematically taught that the largest pre-columbian city north of Mexico is 3 miles from an interstate they may have driven on. That is a policy choice, not an oversight. State curriculum standards are written by committees. Those committees make decisions about what goes in and what stays out. The Mississippians have stayed out. The empty continent narrative stays in. Now, the Interpretive Center. The 40 years between the UNESCO designation and the 2022 capital allocation tell you everything about the priority this place has been assigned. The 1989 museum has been inadequate for decades. The new Interpretive Center is an opportunity. The question advocates and tribal nation representatives are pressing right now is, who designs it? Who writes the interpretive materials? Whose oral history goes on the walls alongside the archaeological findings? The Osage Nation's Cultural Department has stated, in documented public positions, that Cahokia is not archaeology to them, it is memory. As reflected in Osage Nation cultural office statements and documented in Timothy Pockett's scholarly work, the Osage relationship to this place is expressed this way. Quote, "The river, the mounds, the sky, these are not archaeology to us, they are memory." That is the voice that needs to be in the Interpretive Center, not as a sidebar, not as a contemporary perspectives panel at the exit, as a foundational framing of what this place is and who it belongs to. Whether that happens depends on decisions being made right now by Illinois Heritage Agency officials, state legislators, and the Cahokia Mounds Museum Society. Those decisions are not yet finalized. They can still go the right way. There is one more dimension to this story that runs beneath all the others. Visibility. 300,000 visitors per year come to Cahokia. Most of them arrive without knowing the site exists, until they search for something to do in the St. Louis area. There is no prominent highway signage on Interstate 55 directing drivers to the UNESCO World Heritage Site. The exit for Cahokia Mounds does not appear on most digital navigation systems' recommended stops. Compare that to how aggressively the United Kingdom signposts Stonehenge from motorways in every direction. The infrastructure of attention, the signs, the education, the curriculum, the media coverage, has never been built around Cahokia the way it has been built around comparable sites elsewhere. And that infrastructure of attention was not built because the people who controlled those decisions did not see Cahokia as worth that investment. That is an institutional choice with a long paper trail. The Illinois Department of Transportation chose to route Interstate 55 through the Cahokia precinct in 1960. That was a choice, not a geographical inevitability. Alternative alignments existed. The choice was made. The mounds went under the highway. And 64 years later, the state is spending $32 million on a museum to explain what was lost. The accounting for that choice has never been completed. Here is what you can do with this information. First, the Osage Nation and the Quapaw Nation have cultural offices and public-facing government websites where they document their ancestral connection to Cahokia and the Mississippian world. They are not hard to find. They are waiting to be found. Second, Illinois state legislators control both the curriculum standards that keep Cahokia out of textbooks and the capital budget that will fund the new interpretive center. They have contact forms. Third, the NAGPRA repatriation backlog, 90,000 remains, decades of unfinished legal obligation, is a federal issue tracked by the National Congress of American Indians, whose public reports are downloadable today. The institutions sitting on those collections receive federal funding. Federal funding is subject to congressional oversight. You have representatives in Congress, so do they. Fourth, go to Cahokia. 300,000 visitors a year is not enough for a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The visitor numbers affect the political priority given to preservation and expansion funding. Show up. Bring people who don't know what it is. Let them stand at the base of the central mound and understand, physically, in their bodies, that something remarkable was built here, that it was partially destroyed by a highway, that the people whose ancestors built it are still here, still fighting for the table they were never offered. The Osage, the Quapaw, and the Chickasaw nations did not wait for permission to remember. They maintained the memory through removal, through allotment, through boarding schools, through every legal mechanism designed to make them forget where they came from. And in 2019, they showed up to a room in Illinois to assert what oral tradition had preserved across 900 years. The bulldozers came in 1960. The nations came in 2019. The city was not lost. It was paved over. And the people who built it never left.